trying to make it without disagreeing that we're supposed to connect with our source. And if the religion only speaks to the physical, things that we can do, that doesn't say we've connected with our source. It just says we've connected with an institution, that describes our source.
As I would a human being, that its life is as sacred as your own life and my child's life.
And also
they are
treated
equal
according to what you know of its nature.
Right.
And if you feel that a human being has a certain nature and you have that nature, then that's the way your treatment comes out in relation to another human being. An elephant, you may have a different idea of what his nature is. He may not have the same kind of consciousness, the same kind of aspirations and motivations attached to his behavior, and you may have to treat him a little differently. But you still treat him in the context of he's an elephant, and his elephantness is an expression of life, and we're all involved in the whole business of life cycles, and we really don't know as much as we could know about it.
I
Well,
think
if we
still
carry
basically.
this to its logical conclusion or a logical conclusion, don't we run into what we have in India, where they
Yes,
treat the
yeah.
cow as
Right.
as we were saying just a minute ago, and I wonder if this worship or treatment
It
or
isn't
consideration
worship.
of cows has led to the starvation in India.
It
No,
doesn't
it's the lack of
necessarily have to
technology.
follow. We can treat animals very well, knowing that we're raising them or caring for them to further our own. We do feel certainly that the human being is the highest form of life on the planet. I don't think anybody would argue that too much. And if we raise animals, at least raise them humanely. If we're going to eat them, put them away.
Does that mean that we can exterminate the rest of the animals that we're not concerned with?
Well, extermination, no, it certainly has no connection.
What laws do we
Well-
use in with regard to
We
fish
should,
in the Schuylkill River or in the
Let me tie that
Delaware?
back up, Al, because what you've said and what Frank has said speaks to the danger of abstraction, really. I mean, if you come to an attitude about the cow that makes that the highest thing, and that's only one aspect of life that's been abstracted, namely the cow, this process of abstraction and using the thing that we have taken out of context as an absolute determinant of something, I think is the fallacy, and while we're talking in this religious context, I think that's what Adam and Eve gave us, was this business of judging things on the basis of good and evil according to our limited, creature kind of perception. This is good, this is evil. So while that, operates at a religious level, at a spiritual level, I think it might have something to do with the intellectual or mental level where we get our definitions actually about what's going on. When we say our poisoned planet, what are we really doing with our concepts? What do we mean by poison? What do we mean by planet? What are the pollutants? What are the things that poison us at a mental level, as well as the physical level, as well as worshiping false things?
You seem to prefer to think in terms, initially at least, of the mind pollutants, and I'm curious why you would seem to place this above importance of the physical pollutants.
Because I think that the physical proceeds from the mental. I think that the ideas we have sort of control the behavior that we exhibit, and I think that the ideas we have ought to be connecting our behavior up with our aspirations, with the things that we think are most important. It's not that I think the mind is most important, but I think the mind has a function, you see, to connect our behavior with our aspiration.
But Mattie, don't you think it's much more difficult for our discussion or so to determine what is a mind pollutant and what is not a mind pollutant? I mean, what is a mind pollutant might be different. Each one of us might have a different concept, but I don't think any of us would argue too much that certain factors in the air or water can actually harm us physically, and Ethel can back us up on that. That's easy to determine. Mind pollutants
Right.
are very difficult to determine and will vary from one person to another.
Precisely why, if we don't deal with that, we'll never deal with the physical, because maybe Harry, you have some ideas of what actually makes our mind, what is a mind pollutant.
Well, I personally feel that mind pollutants are things that are here today. There are some of the water pollutants that will be a future, or air pollution, which could be a thing of the future that they're concerned about. But mind pollutants are a thing that are here today. Now, our shows, our movies, newspaper headlines, I think, as Chief Warren had stated one time, when he reads a newspaper, he reads the sport page first because this is the record of accomplishment. Whereas you read the headlines, this is our faults and failures. And when one reads the headlines, you would actually feel that the whole country, or the whole world really, is bad.
And you
When
wanna
actually
escape
it's
it.
percentage. Now, many people reading this get the idea, and this possibly with our youth, that this is part of it. That if they would be good. Now, you don't read any things in the papers, especially the front pages. You would never read anything about the good that people do. And I think we should spend more time in our newspapers and television and such news shows to go into the good of people rather than the failures.
So that the kind of images and perceptions which like predominate in everything that we think about and do, really have an advantage over our own behavior. And I can give you one classic example of what I call mental pollution that has gotten this whole country in serious trouble, is that when black people started fighting against the oppressive institutions that were intruding on their personal lives, such as the schools and the various governmental authorities that would say contradictory things. The law is one thing, but the implementation is another. Black people struggle against these institutions, but your whole communication system presented that struggle to the American people as black people struggling against white people. And so that the white people have picked up this mental poison, you see, of the black against white characteristic, which was abstracted from the phenomenon of black people opposing oppressive institutions. And I say this is serious mental pollution, because now, as white people begin to question the very same institutions for the very same oppressive practices, it's very difficult for them to make the connection of the one phenomena, that certain institutions are intruding too severely into the cycle of human life as it affects human beings. No wonder that it's noticeable first by the most oppressed of human beings, the young, the black, the Indians, the old, etc. So this is what I think it means to really understand that there is mind pollution, and that unless we begin with that, we'll be taking an incorrect view of the physical kind of pollutions.
I think one of the things that you're saying is that the press takes a relatively slanted approach on every bit of news. I think Ray probably is pretty authoritative on that. They rarely print, when anyone does anything that's good or kind or public-spirited, this seldom makes the same headlines as if somebody does something that they think is detrimental to health, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness of people.
We should be examining why that
This is a
so.
standard way of reporting, in my opinion, and none of us here apparently represent the press, but wouldn't you agree on that?
I certainly do. I think at issue, though, is not the viewpoint of the people who are reported on in the newspapers, whether they be the institutions or agencies of government or education or whatever they might be. But in essence, what's involved is the independence of the press. We don't agree among ourselves what is mind pollution. Somebody might read page 1 of the newspaper and read about a crime of violence and think that that should not be printed. I don't know whether you think it shouldn't be or not, Harry, but it is what somebody thinks is newsworthy. It is what somebody wants to tell someone else. And if there were any overall standard which sorts out those things which are regarded by some as pollution, you would not have a free press, and you would not have the free interchange of ideas, which I think are essential to any sort of social progress in the kind of society we have. And that's certainly true when you're talking about the enormous changes which are occurring with respect to the black community, or with respect to subjects now in the news, such as air pollution, water pollution, where social expectation is arising, which doesn't permit the sorting out and the elimination of certain stories about that, and therefore somebody else decides what's news.
But Ray, doesn't that depend to some degree on how the news is printed? You can create mental upheaval, thereby causing physical situations which are destroying of the mind and the body. because of the way that you print something. The interpretation is left to the reader. But if you can slant it so that only one interpretation can be garnered, and that is one which is antagonistic to either the oppressed person or to the society of oppressed people, then you are creating a situation whereby a state of paranoia exists among those who are doing the oppressing, and they are therefore become fearful that they will lose their position of strength, and they thereby take measures into their hands to create a situation which is usually a physical one, whereby they can further suppress the oppressed, and thereby you have the cycle beginning all over again.
Well, I don't think I disagree with you. What I'm saying is there has to be a means of communication. And
Granted,
that
I will
the
agree with you
people
on
who
that.
are involved in the struggle themselves cannot control the means of communication, cannot direct it, cannot characterize it.
This brings up the basic question which is implied in the title of this afternoon's program, and that is, what is progress? Nobody's mentioned this. I'm not at all sure we would agree on what progress is. Too many people, I think the great majority of people in the United States, would say that progress is a physical, a material thing. It's how well we live. And I think this is a inaccurate and wrong position. And we might discuss this for a minute or two.
Well, Henry, that also brings up the old problem of if you're determining that progress is physical or material and or both, then you are bringing the age-old question of prosperity versus posterity to the fore. Whether we are doing the things technologically that will advance us materialistically and thereby create problems with regard to population, etc., or whether or not we are going to suppress the material aspects of life and thereby contribute towards the prolongation of the civilization as such. This is what we're trying to determine at this point.
And Henry, I, along that line, also respond to your question because this is basic. When Ray talks about social expectations, I think the meaning of what he says is what I mean when I talk about aspirations. And when I say they've been around much longer than these institutions, which are intruding upon the aspirations, but if we can change the word from aspiration to social expectation, then we can define it within the terms of what Caesar permits as social expectation, and it takes it out of the realm of human aspiration, which I think Caesar cannot set limits on. When also you talk about an act of violence being communicated, I think this is fine, except that we've already gendered the notion that violence is evil. And of course, anybody who's given birth to a child knows that there's a kind of violent thing that goes on with your body, not only for the mother, but for the child. Anyone who is in the horticultural business knows that there's a violent kind of eruption when a seed pod, you see, breaks its shell and the new life begins to interact directly with the elements. It begins to struggle against the other forces to get those elements. When life reaches for the sun, and there are shades and old leaves over new flower beds, there's a violent kind of breaking through, because that's the conspiracy of life, is to overcome all kinds of institutional rigidities, all kinds of decadent dead shells and leaves which are cluttering the planets from lives which have moved on. And if we're going to communicate, we ought to be trying to communicate meanings rather than trigger words like violence, like social expectations, which, as I say, can mean one thing to one person and another thing to another person. And I say we have to search for meanings, because these can be communicated by those in the struggle. It's precisely because technological bureaucracies have abstracted the process of communication unto themselves that we're unable to communicate directly. Those of us who are in the same struggle, those of us who admit to being in the conspiracy of life, we have our communications. We have these mediums in between, and until the mediums sit down and clarify meanings, they will be misleading us, you see, rather than leading us.
Mattie, if I may say so, you're losing us in words. I don't believe the people that are listening get what you mean at all.
Fine, then why, if you get what I mean, translate it, and if
I don't
not,
know that I can.
well,
Is
if not,
it
maybe someone
important
else
to
can.
translate it? What you're really saying
Yeah.
is that we need a new way of thinking, new way of looking at the environment that we're
We
living in.
need a way of thinking rather
Now-
than a reflex pattern behind words like violence and
Okay,
social expectations. We
fine.
need
This
to
is-
think,
This is good.
period.
Now,
Right,
the title says Our Poison Planet.
right.
Does you would put priority on a way of thinking. Now, how long did it take for the Christian religion or for the any of the other religions to spread throughout the world?
I think that Christianity's been around about 2,000 years.
Okay, but how long did it
I
take
don't
for
know
it to
when it
spread?
started, because you see, I
Right.
don't think Jesus preached Christianity. I don't think he started the Christian church. He
You-
was
you want to
Jewish, and he
change-
preached humanity.
Right. You want to change the way of thinking of all people, though,
No, no, no.
right?
I want thinking to be based on the meanings one intends to find in himself, and that communications then follow from those meanings, rather than to subject thinking to cliches which are socially acceptable and which maintain a certain status quo, which I call mental inertia, and paralyzes people at a thought level and puts them in a frenzy at a physical level.
Okay, now this implies that we have time on our poisoned planet for this broad change in our way of looking at things. We have time that we can not leisurely necessarily, but we can all go through school again. We can become re-educated, and then at graduation time, we're all going to go out into our environment and think differently. Now, do you feel, honestly, that we have that amount of time on this earth?
Well, I don't keep time, because the fact that I'm still here, given the conditions in this country, I consider to be a miracle. As I said earlier, I feel personally that the people of which I am a part, namely black people in this country, are suffering genocide. So our time is already up. But like Rita is a housewife, she's concerned. She's raising children in this environment. Now, what do you think about this whole time factor? And, how can we educate ourselves differently or something?
Well, simply, the entire country, it will be rather difficult time-wise to coerce or ask the news media, newspapers, television, radio, to get off the sensational news topics.
No use asking. It'd be a waste of time, waste of breath.
Can't sell a
Again.
newspaper without sensation.
Is that
So
the
it has to be
newspaper's fault,
sold.
or is it
What we
people's
need is
fault
an
who read the newspapers?
Excuse me, Clyde. What we need is an indoctrination program, such as
what?
An indoctrination program. And since we can't go through school again, and since television is such a large media, this kind of program, and such as the Heart and Lung Association is campaigning against cigarette smoking. This is the kind of indoctrination we need today to educate all of the public. Most of them will watch television, and most of them will react.
Right. Now, cigarette smoking is like a personal kind of polluting of one's lungs, putting poison into your body, and this gets us into some other physical dimensions of, pollution, etc. But you notice the connection, that we have to develop mentally, a need to do something physically before we can really do it on a physical level, and this opens up all these other areas of
See,
pollution.
this indoctrination, again, is necessary because people are not even aware of their own
Precisely.
capacity to think.
Precisely.
They do not think. The majority of us are automatons. We do as we're expected to do.
In other words, we've progressed from the Homo sapiens stage to the Homo insapiens stage, thinking versus unthinking, right?
Right.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I sometimes think that animal patterns of behavior are more sophisticated than ours.
Because they're more true to their nature than we are
Exactly.
to our potential.
Well, Rita, speaking of indoctrination, do you feel that it should begin perhaps at the home? You're a mother, for example. Do you feel that you can so influence your children against, say, the personal pollutants such as smoking and drinking?
Oh, yes.
Versus, do you think this should begin primarily in the home atmosphere? Or
Well-
should it spread to the school environment, to the church environment, primarily, or say, precisely before we begin to get into the television media?
First aspect,
Okay.
I have 2 boys, and the eldest is 3.5. We are in a heavily polluted area. My son will draw back the drapes to our front window, and he'll look out and he'll say, "Mommy, come, pollution." 3 years old, this boy is.
Indoctrinated.
Yes, exactly. Whether it be white smoke or black smoke or just a flare, he will yell, "Pollution, Mommy." This has backfired, though, in part, when it's a lovely day, for example, and I suggest that he go out and play because he's driving me insane. He'll say, "Mom, it's polluted." So it does backfire. But you can start it on our level, on the housewife mother level. And from there, you can go into the community organization thing. But even that is meaningless because there's still the communication gap. You need television You need the news media. You need radio to widen the communications.
But you have to prepare the individual for the presentation by the television media. For example, just telling people back in 1963-64 that cigarettes cause cancer, when the Surgeon General came on television and said cigarettes have been found to be a major cause of cancer. Everybody anticipated the cigarette sales would drop off, something tremendously. And then, yet when they made a study and they did a resume, they found that the majority of people continued to smoke. They might have cut down considerably, but we take a you've got to show me attitude here.
Yes,
That-
but cigarette smoking is suicidal. This is your choice.
So is breathing nowadays.
No, yes, but no, because we have the choice of smoking or not smoking. We do not have the choice of breathing or not breathing.
Well, some of us do have the choice of breathing city air, which is relatively more polluted than
No.
some other areas. Some people can have air conditioning. Some people can so control their environment as to reduce their exposure, not to, say that they can get completely out of it, but they can deal in a matter of degrees with the amount of
But
exposure.
you're referring to the affluent.
Well,
the
this
lower
is
middle
the
class.
mainstream American, and this is what this society predicates its behavior on. As
Right.
long as that person is safe, you see, the rest of you have to make an accommodation.
What proportion?
Oh, I
have to have
disagree.
air
I
pollution-
disagree
have air,
completely.
conditioning?
I have no idea, but I do know that air conditioning is a technical thing that we have that can
Yeah, but the
help
point
some
is that
people.
a large proportion of the population can't afford air conditioning and won't in this foreseeable future.
Right, so then you have to remove the pollutants by other means. And I think that Al perhaps can tell us what industry is doing to endeavor to control this, because they are the most at fault. In other words, they put the stuff in the air that we're forced to breathe by virtue of the fact that we have to go back and forth to work. If we could work at home in an air-conditioned atmosphere or in a controlled environment,
I'd like to ask,
away from pollutants.
Ethel, how did you go back and forth to work? Did you drive a car?
Occasionally I drive, sometimes I take PTC, but being a physician, I know full well that I'm exposed to more germs on the PTC or the septi, excuse me, septi.
You get that right now.
I'm antiquated. I'm exposed to more germs on SEPTA than I would be in my own car, but I'm contributing more to air pollution by driving my car
With an internal combustion engine.
with an internal combustion engine, although I try to take very good care of my automobile so that I put out as little pollution as is possible.
Well, the point, though, I think that we're aware of is that you in driving your car
Right.
are creating some air pollution.
Right. But-
And the cumulative effect of all of us driving is to create a great deal.
So you advocate mass transit systems then?
Well, as a matter of fact, I do, but that's beside the point
No,
to
let's
some
do
extent.
the point. I think it's important.
That's not the only reason. I think there are many other reasons for wanting a satisfactory mass transit system, but the emphasis today on industry as an air polluter, it seems to me, is to miss about 2/3 of the mark. I think industry does contribute to air pollution and to water pollution very significantly. There's no question about it. But the recent studies which have been done show that industry is not alone, and that if you had to pick a number, depending on the air pollutant you're talking about, you might talk about 30% or so of the air pollution, maybe more of particular gases, being attributable to industry. But your car is one of the greatest offenders.
Right, but my car is a product of industry.
Right.
Well, you like it, you bought
Right.
it, and
But
you
the
bought
other
Yes, but
thing-
what choice did we have?
You see,
The other
We
thing,
couldn't buy
Ray,
a steam car.
that I have to
Well,
make on this
that's
point,
true.
because I am very conservative, is that as a particular consumer, a housewife or something, I have to do certain things with my waste material, my garbage. I have to do certain things with it. I have to have certain kinds of plumbing to take care of certain kinds of wastes that are a consequence of my living, my health and my
Right.
being. And I also have certain things that I can't do in terms of what I burn in my yard. In other words, the individual consumer, the individual human being, has to take care of the ordinary wasteful byproduct of his existence. And industry should at least do that.
Well,
and to the fact...
the individual
to
does not, Mattie.
The individual
does
does.
not take care of his trash or
He
his sewage
certainly does.
or the exhaust from his
community does.
car.
No, the individual has a responsibility to put it in a can, to put it in a bag, on a certain day, under certain conditions, to take it to certain places. And so do industrial people, as individual consumers, have this personal human responsibility.
But you
And-
haven't gotten rid of the pollutant, you've just
No,
accumulated
but
the
I'm
pollutant.
suggesting that the way we think, you see, is part of the problem here by contrasting what industry does with what an automobile driver does. I'm trying to say that the ordinary byproducts of a licensed corporation ought to be at least as much a responsibility of doing business as the ordinary household waste control of an individual consumer.
I
So
believe
that
there
takes
are
us back
such.
to Al.
Well, I can
I think I
answer.
agree with you, Mattie.
Ray raised a very good point. Industry bears the brunt, publicity-wise, of most of the air pollution, whereas actually, I don't have the exact statistics, or I have them, but I can't quote them offhand. I don't think they're responsible for more than perhaps a third at the most, and probably not even that. Automobiles, domestic heating, just travel and dust blowing around. and,
Electric power.
the generation of power by utilities, using coal or oil with sulfur, all these, well, of course, that again is as an industry, but it's a little bit different. Also, we each contribute our own little bit in our car and our house. And the industries that I work with, some of whom are on the 15 most important
Best dressed.
polluters list, are smaller companies who have spent a considerable amount of money. We've been working with a couple of them, Franklin Smelling, George Saul, for the last 8 or 10 years on the problem. We have spent a great deal of money. We have large programs going in and planned now for future control equipment, and they are 100% in accord with you people. The neighbors may or may not think so because they haven't been able to just wave a wand over their plant and do everything at once. But this has got to be an evolutionary sort of thing. It's again like smoking. 25 years ago, nobody thought about it, and nobody thought about the harm from smoking or the harm from, well, they weren't drinking some of the sweeteners that they're drinking now, but these things are part of our increased knowledge, so to speak, and as we become aware of them, we do what we can. So the companies that are retaining me, obviously, are seriously interested in minimizing and eliminating pollution. Now, I can't speak for all industry, but I think the industry feels pretty much its debt to society, and after all, the people in industry are the same people that are breathing the air. Now, answering Clyde's question, that doesn't mean they feel they can kill all the fish because they're not people. They feel their debt is to society and to the world at large. They want to keep the air clean, the water clean to the best of their ability. Now, again, some of these people cannot economically do it, and my advice to some of these smaller companies is to pool their talents, form one larger company out of 5 or 6 smaller ones, and then they can afford economically to put in the control equipment that they need.
But socially, they won't do that, will they?
Well, a lot of them are kind of rugged individuals. So it's the same thing with, someone mentioned automobiles. Now, I had a discussion with the head of one of the air pollution control sections of a large city. I don't want to mention which one it was because that would identify the man. But we mentioned automobiles, and one of my pet complaints about the automobile is that the government has allocated millions of dollars in research for the control of pollutants coming from automobile exhaust, and a great deal of research is being done and a great deal of publicity. But the average car uses, like a Buick or an Oldsmobile or a Chrysler, gets perhaps 10 miles to the gallon around town. A smaller car like a Falcon or a Valiant or one of the smaller Chevys gets maybe 15 miles to the gallon. If the size of automobile engines was restricted by law to those of the compact cars, there would be perhaps a 50% reduction in the pollution from from gas engine effluents without anybody spending anything. There would
No.
need to be no research at all.
I disagree. May I say, number one, that the Senate did pass a bill authorizing $90 million in fuel combustion engine research. Nixon asked the House to cut it to $18 million. Therefore, that is a large cut.
No, but
That
let me
is-
say this, Rita, if I
What-
may interrupt a minute. You don't need any research to buy a Falcon,
No.
for example, or a Valiant instead of a Chrysler or an Oldsmobile.
Do you really think that because our cars would get 5 more miles to a gallon, the pollution, 66 million tons of carbon monoxide would be reduced to half? Excuse me.
But isn't
Well,
the
do
point
really?
that
Wait a
it's
minute,
not,
it's just simple
it's not
statistic
an
or-
either-or situation, really, that we have to do many things, that we have
I'm
to...
not
think
saying that
that's
this is
exactly-
the answer to
Yeah.
everything. I'm only pointing
Yeah.
out that this is a very simple thing.
Right.
And when I mentioned it to the head of this air pollution group, he said, "What, and give up my nice big XYZ car?" He said, "The heck with that. I don't want to drive one of these little compact cars around." That's not even talking about the small import cars or small cars like the Mavericks. No, the average full-size car around town gets maybe 10 miles to the gallon, the average compact gets maybe 15 miles to the gallon, the average car drives, according to some government statistics, which I do remember, about 9,000 miles a year. Now, 9,000 miles a year at 10 miles to the gallon is 900 gallons. At 15, it's 600 gallons. So that's 300 gallons of gasoline. There are roughly, excluding compact cars, about 6 or 7 million cars a year produced, American cars. 6 or 7 million cars times 300 gallons per car is an awful lot of gasoline that isn't going to go up in smoke.
Well, I appreciate
And
what
nobody
you're-
can argue that, and you don't need a nickel for research, and you don't need anything. The gross national product would drop like mad because the weight of the cars are several hundred pounds less. There would be less steel, less textiles, less rubber, and less everything, which would also be anti-inflationary.
Well,
And
Hal-
I'm not prepared to get into that.
Let's hurry it. Get
But,
it.
Isn't the American automobile a status symbol, though?
Well,
I mean, the
Europe-
big car
well, this gets-
industry has
All
promoted
right,
this for the
to
last,
a
who's
consider-
got the most horsepower and who's got the biggest
This
automobile?
gets to a point that I think
It's
we ought
excellent.
to talk
That's very
about.
true.
Uh,
And that's
re-
a mind thing.
And the other thing, Al, is as far as you mentioned the industry saying they can't afford its economics, there are many cases where this has been proven false. Basically, all we have to do is eliminate that word that they can't do it and figure out how they were going to do it, because in many, many cases, it has been done, and they find that they're, in the waste that they're putting out, that they're actually making money on it. Well, this has been done in the case of, up in Wyoming about 8 years ago. It was simply a person, a conservationist, come in the department that was in charge with the natural resources, and not with laws to back it up even. He forced this thing through, and it could be done in many cases. The thing we have to do, I think, basically, actually in all our pollutants, is start with I and we, and quit blaming it on the other person, and then also ask how it can be done and not come up with any excuses of why it can't be done.
Well, you're directing us to me, and I must remind
only
you that
because
my
you're-
position is as an engineer, a consultant to industry. I am only brought in by industries who are so minded to do something about it, and I can speak for the ones who have retained our services and who are actually going to either have or are going to install equipment or changes in process. And getting back to your one question about whether or not they can recover things of value, the first approach to anything that's going to waste is to see what you can do to recover it and make an additional dollar out of it, or at least to pay its own keep for collecting it. And I think that most of the industries who have any kind of byproduct that has any value are already collecting it. The economy in today's competitive market does not permit throwing things away that are of any use. Now, that takes care of a great many pollutants already. Many of the metallurgical industries are collecting smoke because the collected material is worth 5, 6, or 10 cents a pound or whatever. The things that are mostly turning up in the air are things that are either valueless or valueless in the amounts that are being emitted.
But
And to say that they can't, small companies, a company whose total plant worth is maybe $100,000 really cannot afford to spend $50,000 or $75,000 for air pollution control equipment. But if several of them would get together, as I mentioned earlier, then they could afford a more modern plant which would reduce the pollutants and also the proper control equipment. And by producing in a larger volume, they could probably produce their whatever they're making for less expense than in a small plant. So it makes good economic sense.
Al, I'm always concerned when I hear that a small company can't afford the equipment needed to control their pollutants, and that may be. I wonder if they should be in business.
Well,
if
this
they
is in
can't
effect-
afford to control their pollutants, which reminds me that both UL and Ray have brought to our attention rather clearly, I think, that the majority of the pollutants, at least in tons per year, are emitted by our automobiles. I think you've both pointed out that only a third or thereabouts stems from industry.
That's correct.
I became quite aware of this third the other day as I was taking a train into Center City. It was a beautiful day, and there on the horizon was a tremendous plume of white smoke, and it seemed to spoil the background of all of Center City. And as we got closer, I noticed it was coming from no less than one of the largest industries in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Electric Company. Now, you say on the one hand the small company can't afford the equipment it needs, then I wonder about the large industry, and then, which brings me to my point, I wonder what you might do with your clients and what you, Ray, might do with your clients to speed up, to accelerate their expenditure for equipment which will control the pollutants that are spoiling our horizons.
Well, Frank, may I say something? It will probably take another disaster such as that we experienced in this country in 1948 in Denworth, Pennsylvania, when we had this fantastic thermal inversion process, whereby for 3 days the smog, the pollutants in that area were concentrated there, and 5,000 and I think it was 5,900 people were affected by this. 168 people died, primarily children who had bronchopulmonary diseases and older people who were afflicted by pulmonary diseases. So that it will take something of this proportion to wake up industry, both those who are very much financially able and those who are on the smaller scale, such as Harry has indicated he works with, in order to force them into a situation whereby they will band together. We seem to rise to the occasion when a national disaster occurs. But as long as it only seems to be affecting one or two people by the wayside, we don't seem to be caught up in the spirit of doing anything about it unless the government puts very restrictive requirements on us.
But Ethel, in listening to this discussion, it seems to me that we've been talking in terms of individual initiative, whether on the part of the individual citizen or maybe the concerned corporation which wants to retain you and do something about this. But isn't there a social and public dimension to
Yes,
this?
there
In other
is.
words, I've noticed in the drink softeners, the artificial drink softeners, that you read one week that there's no problem, you read the next week coming out of Washington there is a problem, they're going to be banned, and one day later you hear that all the companies are immediately working on these plans. In fact, they were all along to be ready for this eventuality.
Well,
and it
I-
seems to me that through legislation
Right.
and through this sort of thing, that if the law was so-and-so in terms of measuring what comes out of your smokestack or what comes out of your motor vehicle, and this was enforced, that very quickly we have the technological capability to really do something about this. So isn't the public and social and legal dimension the real key to this, not just
I
the goodwill
agree.
of a few citizens or a few concerned
John,
corporations?
I think what you're pointing to is the distortion of information which pervades the country because we depend on separate systems of education, of social work, of all kinds of people that are specialized, and they only deal with one narrow part of what is a continent which is in serious trouble. This continent among continents, I'd say, is closer to being the cesspool of the world in terms of what we've done to ourselves, and the kind of information we get is always stereotyped and distorted and specific to some sensationalism or some political campaign or a guy every now and then like a Nader. And I take exception with what you did say about we've just begun to get the knowledge. You see, the cumulative knowledge that we have is so vast that we can't opt out on the basis of knowledge, because when we decide we're going to put a man in space, you see, we examine all the potentialities of all, we deal with the trajectories and the cycles of motion of the planets involved, and we deal with all the dimensions of the stratosphere and atmosphere that he has to go through. We don't allow ourselves to operate simply on abstractions. But when we set up corporate bodies, the abstraction that they can operate on is like an economic thing. And as long as they can make economic sense, we don't require that they make human sense. We don't require that they fit into a certain place in the formula for human survival. We don't require anything except the legal abstraction and the economic abstraction. I think this is the absence of integrity
Yes,
that
but
John is
Mattie, I
pointing to.
don't think I said that we did not have the knowledge to eliminate a lot of these things. I may have said that the technology was not sufficiently advanced to do some of these things simply or easily, but I think that every pollution emission problem that exists today could be solved, whether economically or not, it could be solved.
And
Now,
you're-
in the case you mentioned, one of the large utilities putting out clouds of white smoke, this is a real tough one, as you well know from your own work. And there's scarcely a journal on any phase of environmental sanitation or air pollution control that comes out each week or month or whatever that doesn't have some some articles on the work being done by large utilities for cleaning up their stacks from SO2 or whatever. And there are many, many processes that have been investigated. There are lots of them being put into effect, and we will have a great deal more knowledge in another few months.
Well, they're doing a lot of...
The thing that astonishes me, I had two experiences within the last year. One was somewhat similar to yours, Frank. I was driving across the Walt Whitman Bridge coming up from New Jersey, and as I approached Philadelphia, having come down from New Jersey seashore where it was nice and clear, I saw this tremendous white, yellow, sulfur sort of smoke area, and then I saw a few buildings through it. And as I approached the bridge, I thought, now I wonder where this is coming from. And as I went over the bridge, I looked down to the left, and there was a large dump of some kind with about 20 fires pouring this stuff up. And I noticed on the list of the top 15 polluters that the city of Philadelphia itself, I think, was about number 4.
Yes, it
The other thing that struck me, the previous summer, I was driving along the Snake River, and I came up through Pocatello, Idaho. This is a phosphate deposit which happened to show up on some Indian reservations, and very quickly the Indians no longer had the
off.
Well, we have to fertilize,
but
you
there
know.
were two, and it goes into our detergents. There were, as I approached this town from 25 miles away, it looked like the cloud coming up from a photograph I've seen of atomic bombs. And as I got closer, here was this vast furnaces were dumping this stuff into the atmosphere. Now, the thing that's difficult for me to understand, and I'm saying this about myself too, you know, why don't we rise up in wrath the next morning and say, you know, this is absolutely outrageous.
Well,
Because the public is not aware.
The people in
Excuse me.
Well, this is where you've
They
been,
are not aware.
The people in Pocatello are probably rising up, but unless they can get some of the members of the higher body of the AMA to use their magnificent lobby in Washington to create some type of environmental health college for physicians to educate paramedical and medical personnel in environmental health, so that we can establish the relationship, the interrelationship between health and pollution.
But Ethel, does the AMA lobby for human survival? Is that?
That is a
No.
very good question.
Excuse me,
Well,
I'm
this is, I mean, because this is what we're talking about. Can the human survive all of this that the human is doing?
The question is, are we willing to pay for it? Industry, I think, has said, can solve these things if they can charge enough for their products.
No, industry says they cannot because of lacking
Well, now,
technology.
I understood that Al
Mass
said
industry,
this
I'm not
very
referring to-
largely.
Al said that we did have the technology, and he also said that industry was very altruistic about this problem.
May I say that in our own Pennsylvania
I-
state proposed standards, there are a few little legal loopholes, such as where technology is available, where economically feasible. There are all sorts of entertaining little industrial favors.
But that doesn't change what Al said. Now, I don't think it's practical to do all of these things and make it completely clear, clean air or water. But we could do it essentially so if we were willing to pay for it. But the public isn't willing to pay industry the price that is necessary for their products.
They would
I-
be
well,
if
I
they
don't
know
think-
their children may die,
All right.
either in an
I
inversion
don't
or
think
have lung
industry is willing
cancer.
to even sit down and talk to the public about it. I
We're
think
going
industry.
to have to force them to do it.
Well, we can't get them at this level. We get very good help from consultants like Al, who are consulting to industry, who have an interest in this. But it's very difficult, and I have tried to talk to some people myself, to get them to talk about it. They will talk to the government, and the government will talk to them, but it's always over a word arrangement about it. It's never over the human question of survival for people.
Let's say it's Clyde about this. Clyde
Yeah.
is our ecologist. He's our expert in the field.
That's a good point. Clyde, do you think, A, is the danger, statistically, is there a danger? It's true, if you live next door to a company that's putting a lot of stuff out of a stack that's 35 feet off the ground and your window's 25 feet and it blows in your window, that's one thing. But on the overall statistical averages, is the situation as bad as some people might think from some of the articles?
I think it's very serious.
Mhm.
I think that you could start listing it off. Air pollution kills trees. We know right now, for example, that lichens, these are little tiny algal and fungal organisms living together. They break down rocks. They're extremely sensitive to sulfur dioxide. This is one of the major pollutants in the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide kills lichens. This will stop part of the chain of breakdown of inorganic matter in our biosphere. And
This is all part of our life cycle too, isn't it? These
exactly right.
plants and
Okay.
things.
It also we know that air pollutants affect the growth of trees. Seedlings of pine, for example, are extremely sensitive to air pollutants. Okay, that's just for air pollution involved here. We are poisoning our rivers. This is obvious. Look what happens in Schuylkill River. Look at the Delaware River. All of this is getting into the oceans. We are altering the life cycles of organisms in the oceans. We are altering the rate of photosynthesis, the production of simple sugars in plants in the oceans. Photosynthesis produces oxygen. We breathe oxygen. Yet we are upsetting this entire balance of the production of oxygen.
Well, can we afford to change it?
Well,
Can we afford not to?
Can't afford
Yes.
not to.
Can't
That's
afford
a
not
Question
long
of,
pull.
of what is most important.
He wants to know if we have time, he wants to know if we can afford it, but the
Uh,
imperative is that we begin to deal with it.
This
You know,
brings-
as soon as possible.
Right.
Precisely.
Now.
This
Whether we
brings-
have time, whether we can
What we
afford
have
it,
to do, we have to
it.
put priorities on all aspects of this. We do
Right.
have mind pollution, and we do have to change our way of thinking.
Right.
But we also must put more financial resources into the studies that would improve techniques, as Hal said, improve techniques for eliminating air pollution, for eliminating water pollution. We also have to look at why these things are important. Why is it important to eliminate water pollution? This would be part of the educational process.
Well, I would
May I-
hope that with our school children, we begin to tell the truth about the environment so that as they grow up, they will not have these kind of mental blocks that we have. Because we do have blocks about it. We're sitting here opting for time and for money and whatnot, but the children, like a 3-year-old, he already knows it's too dangerous to equivocate with.
I think one of the
I mean, really, this is what you've said, is that
Mattie, I
the
think-
child knows it.
It
I
was
think
not
that
intended.
we're overlooking the fact that industry is well aware of this, and I think every new plant and every new process thoroughly takes into account both stream and air pollution. Our problem really is with the older existing industries, like an old utility plant or perhaps
I think this is true.
an old coke plant, shall we say, or
There-
any kind of an old plant that was built 15, 20, 30 years ago that
Can we
is...
retire them or farm them
As
out?
a
or
matter of
something?
fact,
It's
they
an
are
excellent
being,
idea.
It's like
that's-
it's money.
Question.
they
That's
are being
exactly the
retired.
point,
I-
Mattie. If you're going to talk about making the adjustment, which is now required, you have to talk about the situation as it is today.
What legal recourses do we have, Ray?
Well, if you were to say that a certain activity is now illegal and to just close it down, then there's a question of whether the people who say so, the government says so, should pay for it. These things have happened over a period of time. In the 20s, there weren't anything like the number of automobiles there are today. Cumulatively, because our technology has created this fantastic industrial complex, you have these kinds of pollution in quantities which we've never had before. You also have a massing of people in urban centers which we've never had before, in a way that we've never had it before, so that now, more than ever before, public attention is focused on it. And I agree with Al that the companies do know a good deal about what is happening. It's true that the old plants do not have the technology, in many instances, to convert from the present process to something new.
If they
There
can
still
convert.
is an economic demand for the products they make. There's a hardship in discontinuing the jobs of the people who are supported by it. And there is could be an adverse local effect. You have to weigh the values, ultimate, against the things that are involved right today. In other words, you want to close down a company, put people out of work, lay off a certain amount of economic activity, and not replace it with anything, and do that right this minute? And if you do want to do that, are you going to assign some list of priorities to the different types of pollution and the different types of polluter? Some put out a small amount of something which is not too noxious. Some put out great amounts of something which is very harmful. And in any approach, it seems to me, there has to be a weighing of these.
Don't you think
The values.
that government subsidies would take care of this problem?
If the public
Oh,
would pay the
no.
taxes.
No, may I say, in relationships to subsidies, subsidies for smaller companies, perhaps, yes, but our large utility, and if I may say refineries, are given substantial tax breaks as it is. I would say offhand they are given great consideration, so that they should well be able to afford research on technology. Controlled devices are also, the RCO report and Regional Conference of Elected Officials report suggested that fees be, on two levels, the fees be levied against polluters in relationship to the percentage of their total emissions, to the percentage they represent of total emissions. Thereby, it would produce an incentive to the company. If you were throwing out 1,000 tons of sulfur dioxide a day, as our major utility company is, and you were taxed proportionately, you would have a rather strong incentive to find a way no longer to throw 1,000 tons of sulfur dioxide into the air daily. Would you not?
I still think we're talking about the abstractions that are involved, because, you know, it's very serious when you say you throw people out of work. But if we were looking at the society and if we were examining the quality of life, we'd know that work is not what it used to be in terms of the social need. In fact, we are a nation of consumers rather than of workers. And we've got to begin to reorient, you see, the vision that we have by that reality, that work is not as available as it used to be because of the technological and automated changes in how we do things. But as long as we try to handle one phase of our life at a time, we're going to run up into this impasse of having to weigh or negotiate or trade off. And I'm saying what's called for is an assessment of the societal good, the public good, the human survival. Where is the lobby for human survival? There isn't one. Where is the life machine? There isn't one, yet everybody knows where the death machine is. We just had this whole week, you know, the moratorium by the young people against the war. But the killing, you see, in our society is so much more pervasive than the war. And if we spend all the energy turning off the war and we still continue the killing, you understand what I mean? We are not getting down to fundamental realities of what we need as human beings to survive. We as Americans tend to be too parochial. We're going to discuss it on an economic basis. We're going to discuss it on a racial basis. We're going to discuss it on a legal basis or a political basis. You know, we're only going to deal with it abstractly. Now we are so-called leaders of the free world. What is it that the free world really is? Are we a nation, you know, promoting human advancement and human survival, or are we a nation who will do anything for economic expansion? And that is the basic question. And until we as consumers understand that it is really not realistic to talk about putting people out of work, because work is not the standard that it used to be. There has to be some other...
Well, that sounds pretty good unless you're one of the workers who's out of the job.
Precisely
and,
why I say
one
that,
of the
because
merchants
I am a worker, you know, who can't always find a job. But it doesn't mean that there isn't work out there that I can do. It means that the system is not going to pay me to do some of the things that I think are important.
Well,
So I have to do those things.
May I change the subject for a bit to DDT? In 1600s, people were sick and dying. And to find an explanation of it, they called for witches, and they found them. I would suggest that at the present time, as the solution to many of the problems of pollution today, some individuals have picked out DDT and called it a witch, and that the public is fairly well sold on the fact that this is a witch, and eliminating DDT will solve many problems. I'd like to give you some facts. Has no one in the United States, I believe, ever been found seriously sick with DDT. There's been only one death from DDT, and that was a suicide. You can kill yourself with almost anything if you drink enough of it. That in one of the major plants in California, manufactures DDT, where people have been exposed to DDT for over 20 years at much higher rates than we are. Johns Hopkins is now investigating it. They find that there is much less cancer among the workers there than there is among the population. In other words, it's an indication that DDT prevents cancer rather than causes it. One of the portions of DDT is also being used to control, the only satisfactory control for adrenal cancer at the present time. Now, on the other side, DDT has very largely controlled malaria and typhus in the world. Through this, it's saved millions of lives, literally. In the last 2 years, Ceylon has stopped the use of DDT to control mosquitoes. There has been a resurgence of malaria now, so that there are hundreds of thousands of cases where there were practically none before. Is this important?
I think the thing that is important is that, are you going to spray discriminately or indiscriminately?
Exactly.
That is a very good question. I agree. Certainly it needs to be controlled. I think that, however, the use of DDT by the householder is the part that is really dangerous. The agricultural use of DDT is very well
What
controlled.
about the forestry use?
Pardon?
What about the forestry use of DDT?
Forestry, this is a part
Area
of agriculture.
spraying.
This is part of agriculture.
And it's
Now, I don't mean that it doesn't need to be changed. Possibly it does. But I know personally many of the entomologists. I'm not an entomologist myself, but I respect them as human beings who have just as much regard for life as any of you here.
Well, Henry,
And I
think
respect their judgment.
this is why I say that we have to deal with all of these things comprehensively. It's not that we can look on DDT as an inherent evil, period, under all circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. We have to examine the full range of implications of everything
Yes,
that
and
we're
we-
dealing
and we
with.
can't pass judgment
Right.
here, certainly, on any one product. But another concrete note which I'd like to stress is the fact that our new ordinance against pollution in Philadelphia has come primarily through the initiative of one city councilman who was elected because of his humane approach to many areas which perhaps had been economically determined previously. And the very fact that one councilman can
Make a difference.
introduce a change of this sort, I think indicates the concrete way that we have to work here, because we can decide this is no good and people ought to do something about it. But here's a concrete example in our own city of the way one person got in there and worked away at this and mounted a campaign.
Was that my councilman?
It's your councilman and mine, and mine.
I thought so.
I
Good
agree
for him.
So I
wholeheartedly,
think that,
John.
Good for
you
David.
know, this is what we're really looking for, is the process of those of us who are concerned do have available a political means of doing this. And I do think that once this type of concern is expressed politically in terms of laws and ordinances, that a process of readjustment is going to take place in industry, which is going to find means. I mean, the industry is not going to go out of business. What's going
No.
to happen is that society is going to make the necessary readjustments to manufacture the products without this type of...
I feel that in that respect, the community physicians could bear a great brunt of this problem. If all doctors in communities, general practitioners in particular, were able to gather statistics for the degree of respiratory diseases and the degree of deaths from respiratory conditions based on the levels of air pollution that are printed in the, say, we went to the Air Pollution Control Society and asked them to give us a daily report on the degree of air pollution in the city of Philadelphia in given areas. Say Southwest Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, Bridesburg community, where they have a lot of pollutant plants. And if the general practitioners in that area were able to develop, say, a calendar system whereby their patients who have conditions like bronchitis, emphysema, or cor pulmonale, which is right heart disease due to lung condition,